it feels like there's another step or another layer being put on. Is some of the earlier burials, there was sign like they buried them under rock, like they didn't dig a hole, but a lot of those are like the rock style tombs, but they're not left with anything. But Neanderthal, we have found left with spears and clothes, and so the idea that we have the grief, we have the mourning, we have the reverence, but they're going to need their spear tomorrow, even though they're dead. So, like you were saying, that adds another layer of something, and I think that may be where that spark of spirituality starts to come in, and maybe they had better mushrooms.
Welcome to Questions We're Afraid to Ask.
Welcome back, everybody. Welcome. We have Marcus back with us again. Today we're going to talk about more along what is it to be human and what is faith, and how does that intertwine with us as humans, considering that we know there's other hominid species, and now we know for a fact that some of us are hybrids, right? I sit here with Neanderthal DNA in me, so I'm a hybrid. So what does it mean to be human, right? And how do we define that with our long extinct cousins? So that's the question, and it's kind of inspired by a special that came out today. It's July 18th, 2023. Cave of Bones. It's called Unknown Cave of Bones on Netflix, and it's very, very, very good. So, yeah, where does religion come from? Or spirituality or faith, or that question of what else is there, or is there something more than us? You know, that's
mushrooms.
Yeah, maybe. and you know,
fungi.
To frame this, there's evidence that some of the hominids left their dead and didn't bury it. There's some evidence that some of them buried it, but not necessarily with like any kind of ritual. And then there's the ones that there's ornaments and tools and art and stuff. And as a primitive hunter-gatherer species, think about the loss of caloric intake to leave a tool that works behind, right? I mean, there has to be a reason there. You don't just abandon a resource.
Well, I mean, if you're going to talk about
reason.
the loss of calories of digging a hole to put someone in, let alone taking them somewhere, and then, like in the special, going through this incredibly arduous journey and dangerous journey to put them somewhere. Like, they found food. They were cooking. They were burning enough calories that they needed to eat during that process.
Well,
and
they had fire, right?
Yes.
They had campfires. They had cook fires. They built fires throughout the whole thing so they could get, because the cave, you know, some people imagine cave and they think, oh, you just walk into a cave. This is like more of a labyrinth, if I had to describe it, right?
This is one of those caves where, like, you're watching someone scoot through and you start to get a little sweaty because you're like, boy, that looks really tight. I feel like I would get stuck. Like, it was that kind of thing. But then to think, like, it's not just that, but you're also, like, lowering a body down while you're trying to weasel through this. Now, granted, they're smaller than humans, so that would have been a little bit easier, but it wasn't easy by any means.
No, there's no way. And if you slip, you're going to fall, right?
Yeah,
this is
they
a
didn't
long
have
chute.
ropes.
Yeah.
Well, maybe they did.
And at one point, they literally have to do the Indiana Jones, let's jump over a, pit that we can't see the bottom
chasm.
of.
I wonder in terms of like communities like that, ancient or otherwise, that it's less about religion and more about reverence, because almost all. I don't. This is not a fact. I couldn't prove this. But in his book, Accompany Them with Singing, Thomas Long kind of dissects the funeral rite, R-I-T-E. In church language, we would say rite, or we'd say liturgy. But he talks about the fact that very few cultures in the world don't have some kind of way of showing reverence to the dead. And I would even argue that even in Christianity, our theology, our understanding of God, while birthed out of a narrative that speaks of life, also speaks of death. So the yin and yang of conversation may be more about reverence of those people and burying them and putting them in a place of importance versus saying that there's a belief pattern based on a deity. Because I having not seen, before we started, they were giving me a rundown, but I have not seen this particular thing, and I'm fascinated by this. But at the same time, I also think too, one of the things we share as humans, but it is not just humans, it is almost all life in general, is two things: the reverence and burial of the dead, and the reverence of those who are older. I can think of things like on that I have seen of, whether it's Net Geo or whatever, talking about lions and the way the pride works, or thinking of wolf packs or elephant herds. There is reverence given for those older animals, and when they die, there is a boneyard. I mean, like, there's a place you go to die, and so even within the animal world, there's built into it. So it's primordial. It's like it's in the bones, in the beyond the DNA, almost, in a sense, if you could even go there, right?
Yeah.
Well,
But
I
of
like that.
reference.
I like that, I think we might be able to narrow it down a little bit more to like the social animals, right? Because there's the loner animals, and then there's the social ones, especially like you said, the lions with the prides, wolf packs, versus
Primates.
Primates for sure, versus and even like rats, which we found out are much more social than we would have ever thought. So there's a level of, I think, emotion involved, right? That may tie into this. And one of the things that really hit me, I don't know if you've ever seen it, but there's this wonderful special with Coco the gorilla, who was one of the gorillas that signed and knew more sign language symbols than any other one. She met Robin Williams once, and it was
I
a
remember
beautiful interaction. There's also another video where they tell her that he died, and she remembers, and she talks about he's sad, and there's that. It doesn't really hit reverence, but there's grief, right? There's grief that they're processing because their friend, who made a massive impact on them, because she watched him all the time, and that cognitive understanding that this person that I saw on the TV as a gorilla was a real person that I interacted with, and now I won't ever see again, even though I see him on the TV. That's huge. Yeah. That's massively profound, and the concept of consciousness, and when we talk about like other animals and things like that, how they interact.
I think there's definitely something there. I mean, we clearly see it as you get, like you said, with other animals, when when something dies, they understand that idea. I think there is a difference between when you're seeing that versus the active process of, I think it was what really sort of the way they put it was by putting a tool in something's hand. You don't leave that there if you don't think that they still need it. So that there's some idea of like there's something else, which feels like you're getting more into a philosophy than just a reverent place. You can put anywhere, but the point where you mark the wall and then leave the tool, like we're sending, because they left it with a child as well, which sort of gives it a little more significance. But like, that feels like there's some recognition of like there's more to this than
there's another step. Moment. It feels like there's another step or another layer being put on. Is we some of the earlier burials, I'm going to say it wrong, is like Homo erectus. There was sign like they buried them under rock, like they didn't dig a hole, but a lot of those are like the rock style tombs, but they're not left with anything. But Neanderthal, we have found left with spears and clothes, and so the idea that we have the grief, we have the mourning, we have the reverence, but they're going to need their spear tomorrow, even though they're dead. So, like you were saying, that adds another layer of something, and I think that may be where that spark of spirituality starts to come in.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe they had better mushrooms and better psychedelics, and I mean, I'm only like
Yeah,
slightly kidding, and I'm not really kidding at all. Something
sure.
at some point happened, and something changed, and for me,
I
it
mean,
goes,
a big one is fire. So like
yeah.
that is there's a huge turning point at the point at which we start cooking our food, because once we start cooking our food, we have a surplus of calories which the body can then put into the brain. And so there's a book called Catching Fire, not the Hunger Games book, but another one, that really dives into the idea of sort of the chicken and the egg argument of like, did our brains come first or did the food come first? And it's sort of like I think they happened at the same time. Like that as we got fire, we started to get smarter because we were like, oh, we can cook this stuff, and then we figure out how to keep it and move it and
One
go
could
from
have
there.
rolled into another, yeah.
Right.
Because
Especially,
fire's role also changes migration patterns. The moment
Mm-hmm.
the moment we can do that, we're no longer as tied to foraging and hunting. Yes, still a part of it, but we don't
Mm-hmm.
have to move nearly as much. Communities could become more fixed
Mm-hmm.
because of the advantage of being able to cook things. And that I was going to add in terms of the spirituality connection. I think that's that piece is what separates, and maybe this is because we don't know enough about the brains of animals and stuff, but I think that's the dividing point between humanity as a species and many other species in the world, is that
Which,
when
oh,
we get to the point of death, we make the leap into that grief, and we often, not always, we often use religion to help process the grief by grounding it in hope, promise, new life, theologies of eternal life, of resurrection, all those different pieces. And you can add to
mhm.
that the religions of the world. The journey toward nirvana, any of those pieces. I mean, you could
mhm.
pack that together. But I think that might be, at least in my brain, and I haven't dived down into that a ton, but that might be the dividing point as we begin to work through that, is to say that to be human is maybe to deal with grief in a different kind of way, to deal with loss in a different kind of way. That is not to say that, dolphin pods don't deal with the grief of a mate in the same kind of way. We know that swans have an insanely intimate connection with their partner, and when they grieve like humans. I mean, they grieve deeply. I was just watching a video not all that long ago on a swan introduced back to its mate, having been in a rehab facility for being hit by a car, and the two are just, I mean, they just literally flock just to each other, and they just cannot be separated. They are in that moment. So you can see, not only is there what we would maybe term love, there was grief. I mean, that swan was the visually changed by being in that connection. But I wonder if that, how we talk about it, how we vocalize or deal with the grief part, maybe that's what shifts us into conversations about
and
humanity.
and I have no way to prove this in any way, shape, or form, but my hypothesis for this goes back to scripture, and this is one of those bits of scripture that I think is capital T truth, regardless of what it is, whether it's in the Bible, whether it's in the Torah, whether it's in the Quran, whether it's in any other religious text, because they all seem to come back to this, and it's kind of summed up nicely in John. In the beginning was the Word, and I hear that as language, right? The concept of being able to communicate something to someone else, right,
Mm.
is divine. For me, it's like an awakening, for lack of a better way to put it, that if I couldn't say to you, this is fire, and we use it to cook, and then but now I can. The concept of communication to me is that awakening, and which for me is profound because we know there are other creatures on this planet that can learn language and use it. It may not be vocal, but that may that we need to reevaluate how we interact with some of these. And I say this as somebody who's like a hunter and a fisherman and all that, but at the same time, you know, and link. I don't know. I just that's always kind of stuck with me because that speaking. You hear that like that creation that comes out of it is, it doesn't necessarily have to be a physical act, but an awakening of consciousness act is kind of what I've always unpacked out of that.
And sort of where I go with this, and if I don't write this word down, I'm going to forget it. Where I sort of go with this is that, I think the break point is, we feel the loss. The loss happens. We see that with everyone. There's a thing there, and then the thing goes away, and that we feel that. But I think the jump is that it's the look forward. It's the ability to see that there's like tomorrow. And I think that's a hard concept that early human had to figure out at some point. And I feel like that's why the where does someone go after they're gone idea also ties into religion so much, because it's all about sacrifice and giving away something now for the better thing tomorrow, and that whole, that's all sort of tied together. So I sort of see that in that idea of like, okay, so this person's gone, you feel the loss, but it's like, well, then now what do I do with this thing, and where does it go? And it feels like that's sort of the flip, where it's now we need to prepare this person for what's next, because we can see forward, and now we're going to make a sacrifice so that this person can move forward correctly.
And
like,
I don't know. I wonder if the development of long-term planning and cooperation among hominids directly ties into that. Right? Because we go from like, we see a pack of lions or a pack of wolves work together and plan in the moment how they're going to take down an animal. But we don't see any evidence right now, at least that I'm not aware of how they're going to plan for the next hunt for tomorrow. They bring it down and it satisfies the immediate need and they're done, right? As opposed to, let's not eat all of this right now. Let's save some of this for tomorrow. And the next day.
I'm going to interrupt you for a second. What if that's it? What if it's cooking? The moment that we cook it and go, oh, this is still good the next day. That's where that leap starts to come from. Of like, you eat it and it goes bad, but if I cook it, well, wait, now it's good. And like, I could see
it's
that
good
sort
longer.
of. Yeah.
And then that lets us. Yeah, I don't know. There's so much we don't know, and we're speculating on here.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we're now getting so much evidence that we're not as unique as we thought we were, right? Because we grew up, I think all three of us grew up with that linear model of evolution, right? From, monkey to caveman to us. And we now know that straight line is not a straight line. It is this big tree, and there have been times where it was like the Lord of the Rings. I know I've said that in other podcasts where we have, 4 or 5 different humans or humanids or hominids running around. You got your elf, your dwarf, your hobbit, for lack of a better way to put it. Is this where our legends come from? Right? We have no idea how far back our oral histories go. We definitely know they're prehistoric, right? Especially some of these religious stories that we talk about, even biblical stories. Like we know Noah wasn't written down in the Jewish Bible first. There's, Aramaic Noahs and parts of those stories, and when you get into
there's Noahs in
Sumerian.
every single civilization, because
literally
there was
the
a
name.
massive flood. No,
I
I know.
Yeah. Literally the name
Yes.
Noah we have seen in other. It's Assyrian or it's one of them. I'm blanking.
I remember in high school having a conversation with a religion teacher going, but if every religion has a flood story, doesn't that mean there was a really big flood? No, we don't think so.
Yeah.
What are you talking about? Like,
Yeah.
they've all got one. Well, there were probably a lot of little floods. It doesn't seem like that's what they were talking about. Like,
Yeah,
And that's the challenge, right? I mean,
yeah.
Just break down the Noah story. You want to talk about a description of other kinds of humans. That's where the Nephilim come from, right?
yeah.
Oh,
they're
gosh,
they're
yes.
this obscure reference, but at the same time, we know for certain other cultures around the world looked drastically different and had histories that provided crazy things. I mean, there are stories of David and Goliath, right? The Philistines. Why was Goliath so large? We know that there were races of giants. We know that there were people who, by let's that might be a hard term, but like modern day definitions, like these were people that were 7 foot or bigger,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and
the
functioned not because of some sort of
Denisovians? I'm saying it
No,
wrong.
not the Denisovans. That's a different thing.
But they found
No.
one. They found a hominid tooth that is huge.
Huge.
Yeah.
Not
Well,
to
and
count
then there's all the
Gigantopithecus
hidden
and-
evidence of the North American red-headed
Well, I was going to
giant.
say,
but I mean,
we all know,
you know.
for a fact the Smithsonian has buried all the giant
Yes.
bones that were found in the late 1800s.
yeah, we can thank Indiana Jones for that in this video.
Yeah, and ironically, I just showed my 18-year-old Indiana Jones 2 days ago, the first one, because he's
the
never
first one
seen
that
them.
ends with the
Yeah, and he's like,
No, that's
"What's
the
that?"
third one
And I'm
that-
like,
that
no,
ends
it's
with
the first
the,
one. It's Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Lost Ark,
where they
yeah.
go and they
Oh,
put
they
it into
put it
the
in the
big
big thing? Okay.
And he goes,
Yeah,
"What's
yeah,
that?"
you're
I was
right.
like, "That's where the Smithsonian's hiding all our stuff."
Yeah, that's
right?
where everything
and,
is.
And what's funny about that statement is, yes, it's a conspiracy theory, but it's also true. There are
Yeah.
massive warehouses of stuff that has been donated to the Smithsonian that aren't being analyzed or cataloged because they
just
have
have
too
too
much
much
stuff
stuff.
and not enough budget.
Well, there was the bone guy out of Alaska who it's a crazy long story that I won't even get into, but he sort of reached out to them and was like, "Hey, we have a record here, so 14 crates of whatever, and you're not doing
Mammoth
anything
bones.
with them."
It was
and
like mammoth bones and
mammoth
tusks
bones and stuff.
Yeah.
And it was like, but the agreement says that if you don't do anything with them, then we get them back. So we like them back. And they're like, well, we'd love to, but that building's full of asbestos, and so we can't get them for you. So we'll let you know. And then he's like, 10 years later, I went back and was like, clean up the asbestos yet? No, we're still working on it. Like, he's like, give me my stuff back.
And then they went, yeah, we cleaned it out and we needed more space, so we dumped it all in the East River.
No, that was
a
different
one.
So
But
that
it's
was
similar kind of thing, though.
They
They ran out of space and they're dumping stuff in the river.
In the 20s and the 30s, the person who owned the property before, they were sending all these bones to the Smithsonian, and
that's what it
basically the
was.
Smithsonian got to the point where they ran out of room and just started dumping them in the river. And this guy went on Rogan's show last year sometime and like told people where it was, and people have now gone and they're like, found a saber-toothed tiger jaw, and so there's that. They legitimately dump stuff in the ocean.
One of the challenges that I think when we talk about modern interpretation of religion and spirituality is that when we think of the ancient narratives, you're talking about John, the opening prologue of John, and I would push back on the Logos. It has nothing to do with communication. It has everything to do with God. But John is a retelling of Genesis 1. The Hebrew and the Greek are almost identical. But when we think about the ways in which creation stories are written, they are about answering the question, Daniel, that you brought up kind of as we were getting into this, is about like what happens next.
Yeah.
So the stories are all about an active deity engaging with a people who want that question answered. What is next? What is next? So I think that's the basis of religion, is asking that question, what is next? And it's based on a theology of hope, that even if I give everything I have in this world and I die, there is something tomorrow. And that sense of hope is what, in a sense, drives civilization. That might be a very oversimplification, but if we didn't have hope for tomorrow, maybe not for me, but for my nieces or my nephews or my kids, if you have them or whatever, then that's what drives civilization. That's what drives development. That's what drives research. That's what drives medicine, is for tomorrow. So I think one of the things that we look at, or that I see especially when I read in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and you read those ancient creation narratives, is this desire to say this deity in Christianity that we would call God did this, whatever it happens to be, created the world, created humans, created whatever. It's not meant to be some kind of scientific, breakdown of a 7-day period. It's not the idea, but that God did something for the overall gains of what ended up becoming humanity, Adam and Eve, right? But at the same time, when God did act, new things happened. But we didn't capture the whole story. We're targeting, why is this happening? Why are we here? Why is there bad things in the world? Those questions are what drive the religious narrative. So that's not necessarily scientific, but it's answering those questions in a very different kind of way. Definitely leaning into philosophy, definitely leaning into theology, obviously.
I was recently reading through, Bill and I decided we're going to read through some of the Apocrypha. And so I was recently reading through one of the early creation stories from the Hebrew side, and to sort of to talk about what Bill mentioned earlier about John talking about the word. Something that I've been really focused on recently is the idea of vibrations and what those mean, and vocalizing that kind of stuff, and that being so important. And what I thought was really interesting in that apocryphal, story of creation was the alphabet. Like, it was not only as part of the creation, it was also, we're going to teach you how to communicate with each other. And I really think those two things are super interlinked with each other. The idea of, like, that's why I love John, the word, like, it's not just it's all of it. It's, we can now communicate with each other and express things like tomorrow. There's a I heard about it yesterday, but there's this idea of a universal vocabulary that, like, it's a cyclical idea of, like, how do you get from how do you get to I should have done by just pointing and grunting at things? Like, the concept of, like, well, I did this, but I should have done this is so complicated that there had to be some initial framework of understanding between people that was
and it's
beyond that you had to have language to get to.
It's interesting because we can see evidence. You talked about, like, genetics earlier, and I'm a firm believer in that there is some form of genetic memory that goes in. We see it with animals, right? We see the horse is born and then it's running in 2 minutes, right? It doesn't have to learn to walk the way we do. Where was I going with this? And so language, there are almost universal hand gestures that you don't have to be able to speak the other person's language to get them to understand what it is you're doing. Now, like you said, it's not this intricate language, but there's certain things like, stop, and people raise their hands. We see a lot of this in other primates with, like, physical communication that goes along, that I think is almost at a genetic level. And I know that I'm horribly mistranslating the thing with the word there in John, but for one of the things I've been seeing and everything I've been studying goes back to harmonics and vibration and sound and communication, and it's running through lots of things that I'm watching, reading, and studying right now. And we talk about a universal language. Maybe it's mathematics, because it's a way we can measure that kind of thing, because there are fixed amounts. And I'm kind of going all over the place here, but it's going to tie back into this the Cave of Bones thing. There was an art piece, and when we talk about art, we're not talking about Da Vinci, but there was a carving into the stone wall, which is a lot of calories expended, especially if you've crawled back to the back end of a cave.
They called them hashes. Is what they
called them hashes. It almost looked like the tic-tac-toe or hashtag, or for those of us who are old enough to remember it, the pound sign.
The pound sign.
Right? But we had it at like 350,000 years ago from this rough estimate.
250.
Well, I saw a couple of different ones in some of the websites that went at 250,000 years ago.
Conservative is 250.
Yeah.
Probably 400, but
Then we see almost the identical hash marks on the wall with Neanderthal at 80,000 years, almost identical. And then we see an exceptionally similar one from Homo sapien at 60,000 years.
That's the earliest Homo sapien, but it's
art that we know
a little more complex.
And the Homo sapiens had the same tool, the same shape stone tool that they used. And one of the scientists said something profound is like, maybe we didn't come up with this. Maybe somebody taught it to us.
And then the response to that from the other guy was, well, what if this is a universal shape? These ideas and geometric forms are just universal in hominids.
Yeah. But just that concept of its in and of itself. We tend to be a very arrogant species and assume that we figured all this stuff out on our own, right? That's kind of like, if I had to pick one of our biggest flaws, that's one of our biggest flaws, right? Especially Westerners. We always know it. We've always figured it all out. We always have the answer, right? Even when we know we don't, and we run headfirst into that wall. The stonework, the stone tool work, and the fire, and how to create all that art. I mean, just could you imagine if our little tiny cousin taught our next cousin art, who then handed that art down to us? That is just like earth-shatteringly profound for me, because I grew up in that Western culture. We're the ones who figured all that stuff out, right?
Yeah. Well, and I think that's the biggest, and so that's where I sort of start to run into, how are we going to sort this out? Because when you're looking at this, you have to go okay, so all the stories that we have, all of them that we've written down, come from something older. Well, if they're coming from something, well, where are they coming from then? What does that actually tell us about the stories that we have now? And something that I like is when the new science mirrors the old religion. I think that's truer than anything, because the old stuff. So the thing I've been on is I'm been listening to a book about intelligent design, and sort of the idea of they're a creator and there has to be something there, and you're well, that's the oldest idea. Well, maybe that's because we knew it before, or we understood it, or it's such an old idea that if it matches up, maybe that makes it more true. When you have an old event that happens to line up with new science, you're well, I guess it's, if they called it 500 years ago and now the science backs it up, well, clearly that must be right.
I think there's some power in that, in the sense, I wonder, definitely agree fully with what is passed down. There's definitely some genetic linkage between one side and the other. Totally get that. But I also think what we're describing, though, is community. Without community, none of that gets passed down. If we only learn from generation to generation because communities must rely on each other, right? The adage of it takes a village is not just about raising kids, it's about survival.
So what does that tell us about how old civilization is then?
Well, yeah, civilization is as old as time. It has to be. It has to be. If not, where we are today makes absolutely no sense. Because you can't, if information is going to be passed down and learned, if religion is going to be passed down and learned, if language is going to morph and change, that means it's passed down and being used differently. So, whether it's hashtags on a wall or some sort of, Michelangelo something, art is a form of language. And think of some of the oldest languages in the world are based around drawing instead of an actual alphabet style. I mean, I think of I don't know any of those religions outside of what little bit I know of Hebrew that is kind of based on a very similar concept, but it is letter based in that sense. But but so many of our old stuff is centered around drawing, and that says that not only is art a form of expression, art is a form of communication, which meant that what was being experienced in a community. Therefore, the community, when we drew the bison on the wall for the first time, we all
Right.
understood what that meant. There was a that wasn't a documentary, it was more of a podcast kind of conversation around dinosaurs. And the question on the table had to do with did what we know of the human trajectory exist during periods of dinosaurs? And one of the guys on the stage stood up and is like, "Where do you think dragons came from?" Like, that's across every culture under the sun. Like, everyone has an understanding of a dragon. Like, some of them have legs, some of them don't. Some of them have wings, some of them don't. Some of them breathe fire, some of them don't. But everybody shares this understanding. He's like, I don't want to sound stupid, but I'm going to raise my hand and say that's a dinosaur. Like, but when that's drawn, a community understands. So
Right.
going back to having a verbal, nonverbal, but visual language, just like body language, that becomes a way of communication. So to me, I think most of these communities exist in a sense well past our even understanding. So a question that was shared, or not a question, but a statement that was made was, how much has been forgotten that we don't even know?
Yeah.
So these communities were figuring out. I was reading some stuff on the Roman Empire, and just the development of the aqueduct, like how brilliant that was. And when it didn't work, or they realized that was going to not, they created vacuum pumps, but it was actually based on just using gravity to pull water in a different direction.
Yeah.
It's like, I mean,
Well,
what
we just figured out how their concrete works.
Yeah.
Like, we just were like, oh, now we got it. Now we figured out how that works.
You said a couple of things I want to comment on there that were very profound for me. The drawing language. Imagine even if it's before spoken language, right? The ability to pick up a stick and draw out a plan. And armies have been doing this for centuries in the sand, right? Or in the dirt. Like, you go around. I mean, just look at a football playbook. It's literally like they call it sand table exercises in the military. When just to be able to do that is massively profound. And then there's a movie, I don't know if either of y'all have seen it, called The 13th Warrior with Antonio Banderas. It's a Michael Crichton adaptation of Eaters of the Dead, or Eaters of the.
We've talked about this before.
It's a great movie. If you haven't seen it, it was one of those that underperformed. It's exceptional, but he's a Islamic ambassador who is sent to the Vikings, and he ends up traveling with this group of Vikings, and it's kind of a retelling of Beowulf, almost in a much more realistic setting.
Oh,
but there's a point where there's a couple of fascinating things in it. There's a scene where they're traveling from like the Middle East to Norway, and it's months are going by, and he's literally he doesn't speak their language, so he's just sitting there watching them, and it's like a 5-minute scene, and they're speaking in Viking, and then all of a sudden, slowly, a word will be in English, and another word will be in English, and another word will be in English, and eventually it gets to a point where, spoilers for a 25-year-old movie. Someone insults him and he understands the insult and he speaks, and he's speaking their language. So he sits around long enough to pick up their language to be fluent. Right. And that just shocks them. And they're like, how did you figure this out? And he's like, I listened to you, which is profound. Then the leader comes to him and says, show me how to draw words. And then he does the whole, the Islamic phrase, and I don't want to insult anybody by getting it wrong, but like, my name is Allah, and I am. It's the prayer. It's the traditional prayer, and I'm not going to butcher it because I'm not going to insult anybody. But he draws that out in the sand in Arabic, and then the Viking wipes it away, and then does the same thing, and then later in the movie, or it watches him a couple of times, and later in the movie, and he says, speak what I draw, and draws it out. And then toward the end, he says, draw the deeds of my life. Because he's dying. The guy's dying. He's draw the deeds of my life so that I'm not forgotten. and that is it's just some profound moments in this movie, which is supposed to be an action flick, and it's a great action flick too. But and it's fascinating because it deals with Islam and Vikings in the Dark Ages and the Germanic tribes that are still worshiping like the Earth Mother and think they're and bears and it's just if you haven't seen it, you should check it out. But it deals with all the stuff we're talking about, like different levels of culture, different levels of adaptation, different levels of advancement and language. Yeah.
So let me. So the thing that I keep talking about about this, and probably not on here, but just in general, is I always look at this and go, why are we having such a hard time accepting that things are older than it? It feels like it's been a real pull to get people to be willing to do it, and I keep wondering if it's religion that's not causing the problem, but creating the resistance of. If we're willing to accept that things are significantly older than we thought they do, is there a fear that that's going to rock that foundation that people are? It's going to make I'm wondering if there's a fear
I want to take
in there
that a step further and define religion as not necessarily just Christianity, Islam, but the religion of science as we have it now, right? The religion of the history we all know, right? Because you can turn anything into a religion, into a dogma, I should say, into to some kind of dogma. And just like we have biblical literalists who will tell you the earth is 6,000 years old and we had the dinosaurs and the Flintstones was real and all that. You can have that same dogmatism in anything and I think there's just this innate arrogance and ego. We just don't want to admit we're wrong. That I think is at least in part at play in all of this.
I would say it's not going to rock much. I mean, I really think it depends on where your belief pattern comes from. I happen to be Lutheran. I read a lot of things, everything from quantum mechanics and theology to the latest youth ministry book. And whether or not we know how the progression of humanity got us to this particular point and what's involved in that, to me, that doesn't rock a whole lot because, again, going back to what I said about Scripture, my understanding and my theology is that what I hold to as a Christian is not a science textbook. It is a narrative discussion of a people trying to figure out what a God was doing and how do we deal with what happens in life, the ups and the downs, the this and the that, the ebbs and the flows. And through that all, yeah. Now, that is not to say, though, I have colleagues that the moment you begin to dissect the 6,000-year-old earth, you lose them. I've also got folks, I don't have any in my particular congregation or my setting, but you've also got folks that are like, well, just so you know, the earth is not round. It's pretty flat. And then I show them the video of the guy with the GoPro in Alaska that actually shows the earth turning and all that sort of stuff. It's really hysterical. It's wonderful. He was a flat earther anyway, and he disproves his own theory. But
yes, this is wonderful.
It's pretty amazing. But I think at the same time, when you've got there are belief patterns that are so rigid that the flexibility of dealing with new things,
right,
even though they're ancient, they don't have that. They don't have the ability.
And I don't know if let me just say one thing before you jump. And it's not that I think it's going to rock any foundation. I was more pointing at. I wonder if there is. The Catholic Church is just like, we don't even want to touch this because it's gonna, that there's. I wonder if there's if that's causing resistance. Not that it will be a problem. I don't think it will be, but I wonder if there is resistance to opening up to those new ideas. Just like when the Dead Sea Scrolls come out and people sort of go, oh, what's that gonna do? And is it gonna? And it didn't.
Yeah.
We're just sort of like, hey, more information, awesome. And I wonder if that's.
And I think. This has been my experience because through seminary, through working with a variety of churches, through going to talking to people, talking to the atheists and everybody. It comes back to where is the maturity level of that person's faith, regardless of what they're putting their faith in, whether their faith is in atheism and science or the history I read in my textbook. And we're all at a different point in that faith journey. And there's a point where you need it to be solid, and that's the way it is, right? You need it there. And I've seen this, especially with people who are like trying to pull themselves out of a horrible situation, alcohol, drugs, whatever. I need that structure foundation to be that way no matter what. Kind of the people who I see initially attracted to the hellfire and brimstone style churches to give them order. But then as they've matured, they've moved into a more grace oriented style church, to use a church example for it. You got to be ready to ask that hard question. And Daniel and I have talked about this. I learned to live in the paradox a long time ago. Is it left or right? And the answer is yes, right? That I'm, and that's not an easy thing to do. To get to a point where it's like I need an either or answer, and the answer is, well, it very well may be both, or it may be, that is an uncomfortable place to live, and we're not all there, right? And I'm not saying I'm better. I started it early, right? And it took me a lot of time to get there, and a lot of like faith questions, and this is mild tangent. One of my biggest critiques of seminary was it did a really good job of breaking people's ideas and breaking people's faith down, and not a really good job of building it back up. The difference is I had already done the breaking it down in my undergrad, and so and then they did a really good job of building it back up compared to the seminary type thing. And that was just a critique of that specific seminary at that time, not in general. But it's hard for people to challenge their ideas. It's hard for people to challenge their assumptions. It's hard for people. And I'll give you all a real world practical example. My grandfather was a good man, but he grew up in the deep South, very poor, and was very racist, right? He did not really think of black people as people, right? And then he enlisted and he went to fight in World War II. And he was one of those guys who got saved by the Tuskegee Airmen because he was a turret gunner in a B-17 and ended up in a prison camp and came back and would not tolerate any kind of racism to a black person. It completely fundamentally changed his perception on how they were. But the irony is he still hated Hispanics and he called them horrible things. And, he didn't change there. And he mellowed it much as he got older. And then he joined the Masons, and that helped him mellow more and begin to accept more people. But, it took a profound thing for him to change, right? And he really didn't have a choice in the matter. I guess he did. He could have still thought of them horribly. But sometimes we have to face hard things to change our ideas. And I think that's what you're talking about, Daniel, when you're talking about religion. I think you're just like some people's faith is brittle, like cast iron. And it takes time to mold it into something that is much more flexible. And the problem with a cast iron is it is very strong until it's struck in just the wrong way, and then it shatters, right? And I think I just went on a horrible tangent there, but does that kind of make sense?
No, it didn't make any sense at all. But
okay, none at all. But we're going to clap and say good job.
Exactly. Cool. No, it was No, and I just think there's this. We're reaching. I feel like we're reaching a point where we're nearing a fundamental shift of what our story as humans is. We're going to have to look back and go like, okay, so Things are older than we thought they were. They're substantially older than we thought they were. Some of these ideas that we're dealing with may not have been come up. We didn't come up with them, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
You know, maybe we didn't come up with burial and somebody else did, and we were like, that's an idea. You know, I mean, like, who knows? Because you
Or
look
it was
at
simply
like
handed down.
yeah. I mean, I was just gonna say, you look at orangutans have watched us spearfish enough that now they do it. So like,
Yeah.
it's very possible that 300,000 years ago we saw some other group of people carrying a body, and we were like, I wonder what they're doing, and we we're like, oh, that must be a thing we should do, and it became, you know.
And then
Who knows?
and then we know for a fact that at some point we saw them do stuff enough that we merged the tribes,
Right.
at a genetic level. Yeah, it's just this is a fascinating subject, and we have tiny pieces of the puzzle, and like the guy said, we can never know. That's I think that's one of the difficulties here. We can never know unless we have a time machine, because these species are extinct. So we can only. Oh, go ahead.
I was also going to say, to sort of, we were saying a long time ago, that we merged the tribes, and think about that we still have a detectable percentage of that DNA in our body, and it's been 40,000 years since the Neanderthal died off.
Maybe
I mean,
that number keeps fluctuating, but yeah.
But I mean, okay, call it 20,000 and be super conservative. That means that probably seems like at that point it might have been 50-50. You know, or
yeah.
or,
Well,
you know,
at one point
know,
it was.
like,
At one point it had to be 50-50. You had a 50-50 hybrid, right?
But I mean, like,
one Neanderthal parent,
substantially.
the other. Yeah. And it's not just that there's little traces in our DNA. There are physical structures in our body, like it's the hitchhiker thumb thing, right? If your thumb is straight, which I can't even really do, that's not Neanderthal, and if you can curve back, that is, right?
Yeah.
And the fact that it's more than, at first they said most Europeans had it. Now they're like, well, it's actually most Europeans and most people from Asia, and basically unless you're from Africa, then you've got some sprinkled in there in some way, shape, or form.
And I'm going to throw this in here, which is wild. There's like two crazy things I just heard. One, they think the out of Africa theory might actually be backwards, and they actually started in Europe. They just found something that was way older, and we're like, well, maybe we're wrong, you know. So there's obviously we're always still looking. Did you hear we doubled the length of the universe?
Yeah, I just saw that.
It was 13.7 billion years old, and it's now 26.7 billion years old.
Yes, and that has been published in like the last 2 or 3 weeks.
Yeah, it's very recent.
It's very recent because I started playing with the thing we need to destroy, which is ChatGPT, today, and I asked it the question, how old is the universe? Because I wanted to see and it said as of 2021, when my database was updated, it's 13.8 billion years old.
Yeah,
and because I knew that had just come out, so I wanted to see. This is all fascinating stuff.
Absolutely.
I think that's a good place to stop it. So we'll go ahead and call it there. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We'll see you again next time.